much. So many people came. I really appreciate this. My name is Leigh Alexander. Before I get started, I just want to get a couple things out of the way. The excellent title of this talk was unfortunately not done by me. It was my awesome friend and colleague, Matt Lees from Shut Up and Sit Down and Cool Ghosts. I wish I could take credit, but unfortunately I'm terrible at coming up with things. Great quality for a creative writer. And also I want to give a shout out to David for letting me tether with his internet, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to run my presentation. So, technically incompetent too. Great skills for game development. Anyway, it's been a few years since I have been at GDC. I used to be a games industry journalist and a games critic up until about a few years ago when let's say I decided I did all I could do in that space. And I decided I was just going to quit video games totally and explore some new horizons. So I made a podcast for The Guardian on digital culture. I started writing fiction and, stuff about our virtual lives. All clear, totally. My undercut's growing back in. I was done. So I'm here today to talk about Reigns for Majesty. It is the follow-up to the well-loved original Reigns game from Nereal. It has done pretty well on the app charts. We've gotten some really nice press, and we're nominated for Best Mobile Game here at the Game Developers Choice Awards this week. We're nominated for, thank you. Wait, you're still clapping. I've got more accolades to list. We're nominated for a British Game BAFTA. My role was as the project's writer and narrative director. The whole team and I want to thank so much all the players who made the game a success. If you hadn't heard, Nintendo will be bringing Reigns King and Queens to the Switch. I know. Look, Mom, I'm on the Nintendo. And there's going to be a co-op mode where you have to have consensus with the other player to swipe. So I think that should enable some really cool discussions. As you can see, though, my plan to burn all my bridges and quit video games forever has not been a success. There have been some setbacks. Along with some other wonderful writers, I got to do a piece for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. I'm also a writer on Chance Agency's NeoCab, which is an upcoming narrative experience about emotional labor in the gig economy. And I do a lot of world building, narrative design, writing, consulting on indie projects, blah, blah. I even wrote and helped write and design something for Amazon Alexa. So I guess I became a game designer. I don't know how this happened. The Her Majesty team was Francois Alliot, who's the designer of Reigns. It's his system. He made the system and the tools. The essence of Reigns is very much his heritage. Our artist, Arnaud Debuck, carried on the color-blocked visual style that artist Mieko Murakami introduced in the original Reigns. You can also thank Arnaud for the maze. We were also lucky enough to have music from legendary Jim Guthrie, J.J. Ibsen, and sound from Eric Van Amerongen, so we were, of course, published by the excellent folks at Devolver. So the original Reigns has been extremely successful thanks to this quirky Tinder interface that lets you manage a kingdom and unfold a story by swiping cards. But lots of players started expressing their wish to play as a queen, which is where I came in. So when I was invited to the project, I actually had a really unique opportunity. It's one that I think is quite rare in our industry, in which I felt very grateful to have. We were not starting from scratch. We had this system that had already excited people with its narrative potential. My teammates tended to give me quite a lot of space, both in a big picture way in terms of and also the details of the writing itself, to figure out how best to tell the stories of the queen. And in this talk, I will share a lot of the considerations I had in mind as I worked, and hopefully you will find those interesting. I do want to warn this discussion may contain some kind of binary form treatment of gender. Some of that has been hard for me to wrangle when I'm talking about making the queen version of a king game, when the game uses, historical fiction stereotypes. So apologize in advance for my limited reference point. Obviously, gender is greater than, man and woman, and hopefully these design ideas about kings and queens can be relevant to everybody. So let's start with a quick rundown of the key elements of Reigns games, at least as I see them. So these are the traits that fundamentally formed my narrative design toolbox and were the foundation out of which the queen's story emerged. Basically, characters come up to you and ask silly questions, and you have to make your best guess about the potential outcome of your choices, both narratively and statistically. And then you swipe and see what the effect was. You navigate the story branches and their associated puzzles by swiping left or right. Your decisions have somewhat predictable but occasionally unpredictable effects on the health of your kingdom's 4 key markers, which are the church, your people, your army, and your finances. If any of these become entirely empty or full, it triggers a death and you are revived to rule again. So living as long as possible is a viable goal for many players. It's less so in Reigns, it's less of the primary objective in Reigns Her Majesty than it was in the first game. Avoiding death is a subconscious primary driver as you play. But more importantly, the experience of Her Majesty is about what you can do within the confines of your little life. You can discover something new, unlock an avenue that will create progression. That's the foundation of the experience. And some really unexpected and complex things are often able to emerge from it. So yeah, dying in as many ways as possible and unlocking all the possible deaths is another objective that our players have been enthusiastic about. So many of my friends are like, I like your game, but I'm so bad at it, I just keep dying. And I'm like, well, yeah, this is, you're supposed to. Yeah, this is something of an aside, but it's funny to me how conditioned players are to associate death or an ending with failure, and how a sense of dissatisfaction always tells them they've done something wrong rather than gives them a clue to keep searching. Empirically, I hear this more from my women friends who play the game, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I just suck, which makes me sad. So I just want to tell you all that none of you suck at Reigns. Don't feel discouraged by dying a lot. The story of every ruler has to end, and death is just a beginning. Can you tell the developers are French? So the original Reigns, of course, had a king who could be as hapless or as brutal as you wanted him to be. The game was fun because you were a bit ridiculous, but you still sustained the sense of being part of something epic, which gives you fun themes like the fragility of power, the caprices of the masses, and lots of dark comedy about the brutality of life in the Middle Ages. Now, the first Reigns had an overarching narrative whereby the king had been cursed by the devil to keep returning to life, and he had to find a way to escape these loops, narratively and literally. The characters were mostly comic archetypes, and while there was some courtly intrigue and interpersonal relations stuff, the decisions frequently mainly concerned large-scale kingdom issues, like how to deal with wars or diseases, crusades. Our settings are not so much historical as they are inspired by history. Both of the games use familiar and archetypal types of concepts and events, like a powerful church corrupted by wealth or an unexpected drought causing a war. So we knew pretty early on that we wanted to move this new Reigns story about a queen into a Renaissance-inspired period. Beyond that, we decided not to simply make the king a woman or create a female protagonist without changing her lens on power. I mean, sure, we're making a comedic, flippantly violent, ahistorical fantasy pastiche, but to me, the idea of simply having the ruler now be a woman instead of a man without changing any of the underlying politics or perspectives would not be challenging in any sense of the world. I generally find power fantasies boring, so I really wanted a Reigns queen to face some non-traditional types of friction rather than leaving it simply at like, well, a woman can do whatever a man can do. An equal society asks us to account for and understand differences in experiences, not to simply ignore them and hope they go away. For example, plenty of women achieve power and success within the same systems that promote inequality for others. They may even end up as shields for corporate or governmental abuses because they appear to put a progressive face on them. And we're intended to find it inspiring in some sense that occasionally women are anointed with this type of success. Like Ivanka Trump, yes, queen, right? Like, I didn't want to uncritically replicate the power of the Reigns king by just putting a woman's face on it. I need to emphasize that Reigns Her Majesty is not super deep. It's light, it's rooted in archetypes. It's meant to be funny and bleak. While of course I took the opportunity to make a Reigns led by women seriously, and I worked in a way that I felt was sincere, I didn't have any pretenses that I was reinventing any kind of great wheels. Basically, I'm not here on the advocacy track to tell you that you should celebrate the great victory for feminism I attained in our funny Tinder game, which you can buy on the App Store, Google Play, and Steam for $2.99. But I mean, I do think that even experiences like these can benefit from thinking critically about the intersection of gender and power in the way that we tried to do. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit here today about being a queen, playing as a lady boss, the work of advocacy, and how this all sticks to the often icky and misshapen world of video game culture. Because I don't know, for some reason I cannot stop shitting in that particular bowl of cornflakes. Anyway, here we have Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. Now, Cersei is a bad queen. She is a bad feminist. She enacts domineering conspiracies against people that are rooted in her own bitterness. She's not even particularly savvy about it. She brute forces all her maneuvers. Feeling powerful is the only thing she cares about, and as such, she constantly prioritizes short-term gratification for long-term strategy. Any indignity that comes her way, this bee throws everything she has at it. And I love this character. I would have made a whole game just about being her if I thought people would be okay with being that hateable. This is just such a plausible idea for a queen who has acutely felt all the ways that being a woman has held her back from her desires. She's so preoccupied by all of this, she's hooking up with her own twin brother. She's that in love with the idea of a boy version of herself. In her selfish world, that's all her brother is. Meanwhile, he's probably killed way more people than she has, including betraying his king, which is a serious crime. And the fact that everyone hates her brother has not interfered at all with his success. Even people who hate him admire him, while by following the same rules, people want to see her get taken down. So yeah, she's what you call a trash garbage human, but she is a great character because her story exemplifies the toxic role that gender can play in power. When we conflate a good character with one who is ideologically pure, we risk saying that even in fiction, some types of characters necessarily have limitations that others don't. And for me, the thing that made Cersei's decision so interesting was the fact that she had no choice but to make them alongside, around, and even using men. As everyone in the story loves to point out to her, Cersei is not the queen. She's the king's wife, and even the king's mother. And from that indirect role, she had to be so much cleverer and more of a survivor than she would have been if she had just been a regular old monarch. Let's move on to Beyonce. She's a great queen. Actually, this slide is not, unfortunately, it's not about Beyonce. I just thought you'd rather see her than Cersei. As I was saying, I wanted the Reigns Queen to have the same range of grotesque, silly, thirsty, ruthless, vain, loving choices for the player as the Reigns King did, without uncritically celebrating traditional power, and in a way that I thought could really let me kind of tap into that tireless manipulative agility of a character like Cersei. So I thought, let's shift the locus of power in the game just a little bit for Her Majesty. You're the queen, but like Cersei, you're not on the throne, you're the king's wife. You'd like to have the same kind of power and freedom as the king, but you're surrounded by sabotage, incompetence, double standards, men who are half as qualified as you, yet receive twice as much respect. I wanted the player to feel at times like the only voice of reason in a despairing kingdom of fools, because that's an interesting kind of power that it's difficult for women to assert. So as I was saying, I came up with this whole political rationale for why you play as the king's wife instead of as a woman ruler, but the larger reason for this decision was mainly to enable some of the kinds of narrative beats that I wanted to write. You know, a ruler has to make decisions about, you know, whether to build a dam or not. A lot of the Reigns King's decisions were stat management of the land, but really I was kind of more attracted to the idea of managing the kingdom via social intrigue and sideways influence and making moves behind the scene. Now, that is not to say, oh, men fight with swords and women use words and feelings. You know, anytime I have been interested in simply new mechanics that are perhaps more story-driven and slightly less concerned with violence or conventional power, people are like, oh, so just talking, solving problems by talking, because men fight and women talk, supposedly. And that stark conclusion that people jump to, for me, miscarries the point. When you don't have access to conventional power, you have to make more complicated and more personal choices in conflict. It's sometimes more interesting when you don't have as much control as you want. So let's say in Reigns Her Majesty, if you find the life of a king's wife and a church figurehead demeaning and confining, and you probably will, you have to shake things up through unconventional means, you know, dark bargains, ambiguous righteousness, self-service, using people who trust you, all while making sure you're viewed as lovable and powerful and fun in the acceptable way. Those kinds of dynamics are conflict. They are full of violence, conflict, and cruelty, and tough choices, and messiness. And I think we do those types of mechanics a disservice when we reduce them to, oh, just talking it out. Also, that being said, we did use poetry for our duel mechanics. The team thought that would be fun. So these ideas about the narrative emerged for me most of all, not from outside influences, but from the native systems themselves. This concept that's innate to Reigns, that you're, you know, constantly trying to please multiple irreconcilable goods, you can't always say what you'd really like because you can't statistically afford it, takes lifetimes to eke out progress, that just felt like a, you know, pretty natural field in which to stage an experience about being a woman trying to gain any kind of power for herself, no matter what your definition of power is. So the original Reigns dynamic, where people were constantly coming to you with needs, was, as you can imagine, pretty fruitful to work with. And I saw a great opportunity to build a nonlinear narrative experience of just those thousands of moments where your objectives and your desires, whether for yourself or your kingdom, naturally conflict. I thought maybe Reigns, Her Majesty, could go a little further than the first game just in terms of an interactive fiction experience, which is my personal favorite genre. I thought that deepening our storytelling could invite and entertain players who were not necessarily systems thinkers, and that even those who didn't want to dig into the item quests and the mysteries and the hardcore bits, because some Reigns fans are very hardcore, so we had to account for them, but other people, I wanted to also just have a lot of fun telling the stories of all these different queens and seeing the possibilities. Now, before I dig a little deeper, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the technical bits because we need to focus on the pure white-hot advocacy that I'm beaming out into this room. But people do ask me all the time how I approach writing these modular stories. And by modular, I mean the way that individual and even unrelated cards hopefully tend to always coalesce somewhat into miniature arcs for each reign. The answer to that is really, it's as much about how we balanced it as it was about how I wrote it. So real quick, I wrote individual cards, had to create the moment within the length of a tweet, and each card had to offer diametric expressive choices, as well as clue the player about the potential effect of those choices. And then I had to decide the result of those choices. So every card has a weight, a probability which determines how likely it is to appear. I suggested the statistical impacts of choices, as well as link them up to other cards that could appear as certain consequences later. So in addition to just having writing at my disposal as a utility, I could also decide how this network of probabilities performed. The words you read are only half of the narrative experience. It's also about how it feels and behaves, how it's paced. And luckily I had expressive tools at my disposal, the system that Francois Alliot created, which he used to make Reigns. This is where I wrote the game. It's in Google Sheets. Not sure how well you can see it, but as you can see, we have the ability to designate the bearer who appears on the card, what the questions they ask, conditions that are relevant to the card's appearance, statistical effects, and then other outcomes, like let's say a certain decision adds something to the deck or sets a new permanent condition. People have asked, like, oh, you should make like a Reigns card game, like with physical cards, but hopefully this illustrates that that would probably, in my view, be difficult because it's not the cards, it's the system in which the cards are performing. So I could essentially use these numbers as well as words as tools to construct the story. The statistical impact of something you do in the game gives you narrative information. To use a heavy-handed example, let's say that in this world there's a contentious relationship between the church and practitioners of magic, and that could be communicated numerically by watching the numbers on the church decline when you do something that feels magical or feels rebellious. So even though that was a statistical assignation, it was something I could use for narrative expression. As a team, Francois had to do a lot of balancing for me because, I count on my fingers. So we did a lot of adjustments as a team to balance the game and make sure it felt, the way it was supposed to feel, the gating was working properly. Hopefully, everyone's experience is different. Every reign is different. There's a progression, but every reign is still different. There are hopefully lots of harmonious and happy accidents, and hopefully it becomes transparent enough that you feel a sense of direction, but not so much that it's predictable. Ultimately, it was like, I liken it to doing knitting in a spreadsheet, starting with moments and conflicts that I wanted the player to feel, and then making them link up, reference one another, and loop back. In a way, it was a lot like an IF authoring tool, because all the great ones use the language of weaving, like a knot or a skein or a thread, a twine, So great, we have this system that can very effectively make you feel put upon, disempowered, and overwhelmed by choices. And that inspired me to make a game about how hard it is to be taken seriously as a woman, so that anyone who picks this up gets the chance to experience that. Get me my Feminist Advocate Award, right? So although I've always been a great believer in the strength of interactive environments to help shift people's perspectives, thanks to the great critical writings and games of designers like Robert Yang or Anna Anthropy, I've come to strongly believe that simply reproducing an oppressive system so that others can experience how horrible it is not a sufficiently constructive way to approach our work. I think the options that we give players for how to consider or act on those experiences are much more important. So even though I was conscious of the expectations that Reign's Her Majesty should at least be trying its best to be a feminist work, and I'll get back to that in a bit. The social challenges that the Queen faces are hopefully only a catalyst for a broader and more ambiguous dialogue. Again, the system is horrible, we get it. You know, anguished portrayals of how bad it is for women or people of color or otherwise marginalized individuals make white guys feel like they're being enlightened, but for the rest of us on our end, I think we're all much more interested in how folks like ourselves cope within the system, how we comfort each other, how we prevail, and even how we act out. So basically, rather than write things that happen to the Queen, the real story is in how she can respond. Generally, we give yes or no choices because those are most functional from a design standpoint. Players tend to sometimes swipe without reading. They've known one way as yes and one way as no. But we went for tonal variety where possible, just because sometimes it's so much fun to emphatically say nope instead of no to some incompetent guy. And all the guys in Reign's Her Majesty are incompetent. Like, every character is ridiculous, but the dudes are especially so. And I gave them all, like, really ridiculous names, because fuck it. Thank you. I also tried wherever possible to make sure that the binary choices were more nuanced than accept this or reject it, or be nice or be mean. I hope that Reigns 2 would also invite players to consider things like when it's appropriate to set boundaries versus tolerate, whether it's better to be generous or self-serving, or whether generosity itself can sometimes be self-serving. I did not actually make the Queen's husband the king an abusive or tyrannical ruler. He's mostly like a clueless one who's in your way and doesn't take you seriously, but you can be tender to him sometimes if you want. It's like being married to Homer Simpson. So a good queen tries to please all her people. Most people tell me, like, and again, especially my woman friends, I keep dying because people love me too much. I keep being trampled by my adoring fans because we are taught to do labor that makes other people feel good. So a good queen tries to please all her people, but there are a number of moments in the game that people-pleasing for its own sake leads to consequences. A lot of people say dying because everyone loves you is the most common death, and I think that's probably an intentional result of the way we balanced it. And there are moments in the game that you cannot unlock without being self-involved or without hoarding wealth. And that's not so much about empowering cruelty as it is about looking at the circumstances in which cruelty flourishes. I also included a few other concepts that I thought would create an environment to kind of play with the issues we've been talking about. The Queen gets involved with various magical women, which hopefully taps into the idea that magic has been a form of resistance for oppressed people since the beginning of time. But I mean, like, if she's the Queen, who is royalty, how entitled to that vocabulary is she really? Are there going to be consequences for her if she misappropriates it? So although you play through the lives of many different queens who share the same soul, the one trait that she always has is that she's not from the kingdom from whence she's come in order to get married. Like, giving her some outsider status gives her something of a place to connect with the other characters in her kingdom who feel a sense of unrest under this gilded patriarchy. And we have some romance options. Like, they're small, but they're important to people. Hopefully developing those more soon. You can be super gay in the game if you want, and there's an achievement for if you manage to get something going on with all 4 romance options in one reign. I hope that, we can maybe bring that number up a bit. Why not? So as I've been saying, if we made a game that primarily rewarded obedience or generosity or being good, and where we punish queens for being sloppy or self-indulgent or horny, then we still suggest that there is an ideal route, one single ideal route to power for women. I didn't want to make statements on power. I did not want to freaking yes queen this game. I wanted, honestly, to explore a lot of these questions about my own privilege, as well as being at the same time a woman who wants change. I wanted to create a flexible and nuanced environment for this. For example, the internet always says that self-care should be our first priority, the better to have resources available for others. But in a decadent kingdom collapsing under unstable wealth, we can rationalize almost anything as self-care. And in light of that, is it always for all of us going to be a constructive choice or just a constant temptation? Like, do I just want to feel good about the fact that I bought all these fucking gold sheet masks? I mean, these questions are what I wanted to express in the game. Basically, when you design an oppressive system and also design for the equally powerful desire to escape that system or to gain individual power as a disadvantaged person, you create a lot of complicated space. I really love what my interactive fiction idol, Emily Short, had to say about the feminism in the game. I definitely did set out to make fun of a certain brand of feminism and the commercialization thereof, but only as one of many ambiguously helpful routes for women trying to figure out how to make their most ethical way in the world. I don't know. I mean, after some of the experiences I had in video games, especially trying to have a voice in the consumer space, I came away suspicious of the very idea that we could make a video game feminist simply by having people play as a girl, or anti-racist simply because it has representation. What I'm about to say may shock you, but writing Reigns Her Majesty was a job, which I did for money. I did it because I trusted the team and I had something to say, sure. But at the end of the day, have I done advocacy or did I work on an app? You know, if you played Reigns Her Majesty extensively, then you might know that there is some meta-narrative I attempted to put in there about how suspicious I am of companies celebrating women's experiences for money. So if you've seen some weird loose threads to pull at in there, that's what those are sort of leading toward. And I'm so lucky to get to speak at GDC in the first place, to advance my own ideas and to access new opportunities. But obviously, as if we could forget, this event is out of reach of most developers. My colleague Rami Ismail, he's now running the One Reason to Be panel that Brenda Romero and I used to do. And Rami has been trying to, we started out just celebrating women, and now we welcome, the panel welcomes all kinds of perspectives and expertise that have been marginalized in the traditional industry, which I think is ideal. But over the past several months, Rami's been having a really hard time having to repeatedly deal with visa rejections for the speakers that he wanted to bring here. It just sounds like it's been heartbreaking for everyone involved. So, there's always a lot of questions to be asked about our participation in these ecosystems, about being here in San Francisco. Who really materially benefits from expanding our audiences and marketing this idea of ourselves as progressive? Like, have I been doing advocacy in this room, or did I just give a narrative design talk? Like, am I an advocate talking at my expensive industry conference about my Queen video game? Am I even adequate? I don't know. And for me, that is more of an interesting narrative and thematic space for me to be working in. It's more interesting than any number of slay queen empowerment fantasies. Maybe it can be more interesting to you too. Please pay me to write your games. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, David. I don't think I left any time for questions. I think that's the end of my time, right? Yeah? 4 minutes? Oh yeah, I can ask, people can ask a couple questions if they're short. If anyone would like to come up to the mic.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question, I guess, would be, do you feel like there is something wrong with the Ask Queen empowerment fantasy? Because, sometimes you really just do need to escape into that.
Well, no, I think it would be wrong to dismiss any kind of person's fantasy unilaterally. But what I mean specifically is the branded and marketed version of the lean-in brand of corporate women's empowerment. Like, if I had a daughter, I would have bigger dreams for her than to become like a capitalist shitlord. You know what I mean? Like, thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, of course, yes, Queen is fine, but let's not purchase the hats, Anybody else?
Hi. So you made a point about the idea of an oppressive system versus one that you can subvert and change in games, and how we maybe need more narratives about people overcoming their problems. But how do you feel about games as a reflective tool in that sense?
I think it really all depends on the game. Like I said, games do have the ability to reflect to others experiences that they wouldn't ordinarily encounter, and some of those have been valuable. There's people whose lives have been changed by what we call empathy games. But I think, people that I know that work in that sector as developers eventually felt used up by that space, that they'd served up their experiences on a platter to educate others, and then they did not receive any recognition or monetization of that work in any way. So I think, yes, it's important. Games can be a mirror, but for the sake of the creators and their experiences, that's not enough. To show people something new. I want to know, when you've played this empathy game, what are you going to do now about the state of the world? What are you going to do now on behalf of the person who made it? So yeah, I think it's complicated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm a women's study major, and I've been doing a lot of feminism game, try to promote feminism game like the one you have. And my biggest issue is when all my feminist friends, they hear the word game, they were like, no.
I know.
It's patriarchy, it's violent, it's destroying people, and it's really hard for them to play game like this when there's kind of a bad reputation about what video game is. And I wonder, like, if you have experience like that, and like, what can we do as a game designer?
Yes, I have experienced that. I spent like the good years of my 20s trying to tell people about like anti-patriarchal video games, and the audience is so small, and the willingness is so low, and it is so depressing. I think largely that's on the fault of that's on the shoulders of the commercial games industry, which has thrived on marketing this idea of itself as capitalist power fantasies for white guys, and I think the larger industry is going to need to evolve before people are willing to give it another chance. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of like scapegoating and moral panic about video games and how they like make people violent. There's a lot of stuff, the categorization of the industry that is unfair and unproductive. But I mean, yeah, absolutely, yes, I feel you. And if I had an answer, maybe I'd still be working in video games criticism. Thank you. One more, maybe? Oh, sorry, hi.
Two things. One is please stay in the industry.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, thank you.
It's really good to hear like this sort of advocacy.
Thanks, it's been a lot. Thank you.
And so the other question is sort of about the AAA industry and the console industry. And I feel, having been in it for long enough, that we're getting better, but I don't know, being like a straight white male between the ages of 18 and 34, I don't know if that's actually a thing. So what's your perspective on it?
I think it's getting better. I do. There are stuff that are shown at commercial showcases now that I wouldn't have dreamed of seeing when I was young and starting out. It felt like a very hostile space to me when I was starting out, and now some of it still feels like there's a lot more progress to be made. But I do think it's getting better. I really do. Awesome. Maybe I'm being naive, but I think it is possible for it to get better, and I think it has been. Thank you. I think that's all my time. Thank you.